Welcome. Good to see you. It's been an exciting day here. I had a wonderful program earlier today right here across the hall with Tom Friedman. And we're looking forward to this panel tonight. I am really, really excited because you have behind me four of the really great journalists in our country covering politics and government at what is an enormously consequential time. And obviously, we're 8 days away from a major change in government, and we are going to, over the course of this quarter and really into the spring, be examining the impact of that and trying to anticipate what the Trump era will mean. And tonight's discussion with reporters who have written and covered both the campaign and the post-campaign, Congress, and in the case of our moderator, has great historical context because she's covered politics for a long time in Washington, one of the really distinguished figures in political journalism, Susan Page. I don't want to give away your introduction. We will invite questions after a discussion. We're going to prioritize students for those questions, and if we run out of student questions, then the young at heart can step up to the microphone and ask theirs. Please silence your cell phones. And I want to also announce that after tonight's event, students who are interested in pursuing a career in public service, specifically with the State Department, are welcome to come to the IOP across the street at 5707 Woodlawn and hear from a career foreign service officer. So I encourage you to do that. And with that, it's my, I want to make sure I get your name right, your last name, the pronunciation of your last name. It's phonetically spelled here, but still challenging. Quentin Dupuis, right? Excellent. Who's a political science and public policy double major in the college and comes from New York. Where in New York? New York City. In New York City. Where'd you go to school? Hunter. Okay, Stuyvesant High School. Yeah. Sorry, we're having a thing here. Quentin.
Hi, everybody. For me and many of my peers, 2016 was the first year that we were able to fully participate in a presidential election. And it was certainly exciting. Regardless of your political ideology, November 8th and the months leading up to it was a deeply emotional time. In a little over a week, as David said, the president-elect will take office. For me, it will be the first time as an adult that I see the White House without the Obamas in it. For all of us, it will be the start of an administration that in some ways is unlike any other that we have seen before. Tonight, we will hear from a panel of leading political journalists who will share their thoughts and insights about the changes coming under the new Trump administration. Our guests include Ben Domenech, who served as President George W. Bush's youngest political appointee as a speechwriter for Health and Human Services Secretary Tommy Thompson. Mr. Domenech is the co-founder and publisher of The Federalist. Also joining us is Ashley Parker. Ms. Parker covered Trump's campaign and transition for the New York Times and now works as a White House reporter for the Washington Post. To round out tonight's panel, we have Jeremy Peters, a Pulitzer Prize-winning politics reporter at the New York Times' Washington Bureau. The discussion will be moderated by Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. Ms. Page has covered 10 presidential campaigns and will soon be covering her 6th administration. She has twice won the Gerald R. Ford Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency. Please join me in welcoming tonight's guests.
Hey, good evening. It's great to be here. I know all of us are honored to be here at this great institution, and particularly at the invitation of David Axelrod, for whom we all have so much respect. In fact, we were meeting beforehand, and rather than talk about America in the Trump era, the new administration, we thought we would just tell Axelrod stories. It has been a pretty remarkable 2016. It has been a pretty remarkable 48 hours. We had the the speech by the outgoing president, just about 3 miles from here. We had the publication of extraordinary allegations against our president-elect, something beyond anything we've seen before. We had Donald Trump's first news conference as president-elect. It's truly one of the most remarkable news conferences in American political history. I've covered presidential news conferences for 5 presidents when they were in the White House. I had never seen anything like the news conference we saw yesterday. We'll talk a little about that. And in 8 days, of course, he'll be inaugurated as our 45th president. So we do want to talk about America in the Trump era, the new administration, and we look forward in a bit to taking questions from you about what's on your mind. So let's start with a critical question, which is, what is Donald Trump really like? And Jeremy, you were covering Donald Trump before he was a politician, when he was a businessman. Tell us about your first encounter with Donald Trump.
I actually think he was always a politician in the sense that he was always working some angle. Maybe he's more accurately described as a salesman that way, but he's certainly always been both. I covered New York politics early on as a young reporter. I'll never forget the time I had to write a story about this proposed millionaires tax that the New York State Senate was considering. So I thought to myself, well, okay, I'll call the richest guy in New York. So I picked up the phone, I called Donald Trump's office, and I asked to be put through to him. They said, okay, we'll see if he's available. I don't know. We'll put you on hold. They put me on hold. My mom calls. I pick up the phone. I start talking to my mom. I hear someone on the other end, because I had my cell phone in one ear and the landline in the other. On the landline, I hear someone click over and say, hello. And I said, excuse me, sir, could you just hold on 1 second? And I proceeded to finish the conversation with my mom, which was not a short conversation, as anyone who talks to their mother knows. So I go on, end the conversation with my mom, pick the receiver back up for the landline, and it's Donald Trump. And he had waited on hold for me that entire time because, and to me, that just kind of solidified that this guy wants media attention. He was always eager to talk to reporters. He was one of the easiest people in New York to get on the phone. And even as a presidential candidate, remained somebody who was very willing to talk, not always on the record, but I think this is unique for a presidential candidate in that he would call you after rallies sometimes and say, it was this bizarre thing where he was both kind of seeking affirmation but also trying to get inside your head as a writer to try to shape the story in some way. He would call and say, well, what do you think of the story? And I'd say, well, I'm on deadline. I have to finish the story. Leave me alone. But he really does have this both understanding and desire for media that is unlike anything I think we've ever seen in a president.
Well, actually, talk a little about, I know you covered him a lot during the campaign. Talk a little about Trump's temperament, what you saw during the campaign and what it tells us about how he might behave as president.
Sure. Well, one thing with covering him that journalists very quickly became aware of was just how careful you had to be for 2 reasons. And one was because you always had to second guess your information, because if you talked to a top advisor who had talked to Donald Trump at 9 a.m. and they told you this is what Mr. Trump is going to do, by 10 a.m. when you talked to the next advisor, that information could have totally changed, because he was literally sort of like changing on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis, often based on the last person he talked to. So you always kind of had to say, well, I know Donald Trump told you this, but like, what did he tell the person at the end of the day, the last person in the office, which was a weird way to sort of have to fact check. And then another thing that was interesting was, normally with most other politicians I've covered, if, for instance, President Obama was going to appoint Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State and it leaked out, he would probably be frustrated and angry, but he would not change his pick simply because the media had reported it. But what was weird with Donald Trump is if you reported something he was going to do, he might then not do it simply because he was angry it was leaked, or simply because he had gone on Twitter and seen the reaction to the pick and didn't like some of the comments, so he changed it, or because he wanted the element of surprise, and now the element of surprise was gone, so he was going to choose someone else. And that is a very weird way to choose a cabinet or to make policy decisions. So as a reporter, you always had to write, Mr. Trump is expected to, because your story could actually change his behavior.
So there was one time I remember you were called out by him by name.
I was.
At a rally. What did he do?
So I had done a story with my colleague Maggie Haberman, and it was a story he didn't like. It wasn't a super positive story, and it had just posted before a huge rally of 20,000 people in San Diego. And I was sitting there, and you may remember the media was sort of penned in. We were in a metal sort of cage, or just barriers, metal barriers, but in the middle of the room.
Not over our heads. And
Yeah,
stuff,
not over our heads. It was
you
just-
could get out of the cage. Yeah.
We were among bike racks, but basically you were in the middle of the room, and you were always part of the act, because there was always a moment he would point to the despicable media. But in this moment, our story had posted, and someone had clearly handed it to him, and so he starts going, there's a woman named Haberman and a woman named Parker, and they wrote the most disgusting article, and like, I hope they're not here now. Like, she's not here, is she? And so and I'm sitting in the front row, and the entire crowd just turns around and starts booing and hissing, looking for these evil women. And I had this name card in front of me, and part of me was sort of tempted to just like hold it up, because I clearly had the answer they needed, but another part felt like this was not a savvy or safe idea. And so I just, kind of kept on typing and looked around for that woman, and then the crowd finally moved on. But it is a bit of a surreal experience.
Yeah, we'll see if he continues this kind of behavior for the press. Well, let's step back, Ben, and talk about America in the Trump era. Are we entering the Trump era? And if we are, what does that mean?
Well, I think we are, certainly, at least in the short term. Certainly the American right is entering the Trump era, which is really a position of realignment, I think. It's actually fairly rare in the history of democracies to have the kind of party that looks like the Republican Party. It's not typically what you see. Typically what you see is something that looks more like a pro-business party at the center of a coalition that has maybe center or center-left values. And then a right-wing party that is more nationalist, that is more populist, that doesn't necessarily have the kind of free market rhetoric that has been an element of Republican politics for so long. Certainly doesn't have the kind of broader views when it comes to free trade and free markets around the world as being something beneficial. And I think that what we're really seeing here in America is the decline of a coalition that had been a significant element of the right for a long time, the Reagan coalition, that really stretches back before Reagan even became president, and we're seeing the rise of a Trump coalition. Now the question really is how wedded they are to these approaches in the long term. And I think that when it comes to areas of policy, that's going to be something that's going to be tested and tested quickly by a lot of different steps that are going to be taken under this administration. There's been an enormous push within the Republican Party for reform when it came to the economy. When it came to their economic message, there's been figures like Paul Ryan who look at them, view themselves as being in the Jack Kemp tradition, wanted to reform the party in ways that would appeal to working class voters with tax credits, with various sort of different approaches to twisting and turning the knobs of policy from Washington. And I think that what we found in this cycle is that was not good enough at all. The degree to which other candidates embraced those policy agendas, whether it was Marco Rubio, whether it was Jeb Bush, whether it was others, all of that faded away in response to Trump's message, which spoke, I think, more directly to their concerns. And so I think the real challenge right now is there is a dominant party, not just in Washington, but across the country, of Republicans who are going to have to figure out who they really are now, how much they are the party of Trump, how much they are the coalition of Trump. And the answer to that question could have enormous ramifications, not just during Trump's presidency, but beyond it.
But here's one of the peculiar things. It's the dominant party, no question. The Republicans hold the White House, the House and Senate. They're in a position to get a more conservative Supreme Court. They control more state houses than they have in decades. And yet, by the way, Hillary Clinton beat him with the popular vote. So, Jeremy, what challenges does that present for Trump as president? Does it present some challenges? Does it make a difference that he lost the popular vote?
I think it's more challenging for the Democratic Party, actually, because it basically relegates the Democratic Party to a minority status in the majority of our states and our local government going. Like, one thing that the right has always understood better than the left in our times is the need to get involved and active in local government, and that's from like the local school board on up to the state legislature, and those have been overlooked by Democrats a lot in recent years, and now they're paying the price for that. I think the Hillary Clinton won the popular vote excuse is a way for Democrats to avoid having the harder conversation about what was wrong with their message to the American people and the identity politics that they played through the Clinton campaign. And that's going to be what they have to reckon with going forward.
But actually, you know, it looks to me like it bothers Trump that he lost the popular vote. Does it?
Oh, it absolutely does, because if, you know, in a way, sort of winning is the only ideology that Trump has sort of at its core, and it is also the only thing he understands. And on some level, I think he does understand Hillary won the popular vote, and that is sort of like the biggest assault, the biggest threat. And if you also accept the argument that so much of what Trump has done, or what has motivated him, has been sort of these slights, whether it was President Obama making fun of him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, or he was the kid from Queens and he always wanted to be part of Money in Manhattan, and even when he made all this money, it was sort of the way he spent it, you know, it was gauche, and it was not the way the actual Manhattan rich people accepted it. And they sort of didn't let him into these clubs either. And I think that's something that will frustrate and motivate him.
And that's consistent with what we know about his needs as an individual, that maw inside of him that craves affection. You know, John Mulaney's routine about Trump is still the best thing that I think has ever been done when it comes to humor about him. And he talks about him as waking up every morning and saying to himself, what would a cartoon rich person do? And I think that that's not, what you have to recognize about all this is the slights are what allowed him to play this game of being a traitor to his class. Despite the fact that he has for his entire life up to this point effectively been a limousine liberal who, you know, was not someone who was at all, you know, checking any of the boxes that a candidate for the Republican nomination ought to accept, he was able to basically turn to a lot of these people and say, see, these elites, they don't like me and they don't like you either. You know, they don't respect you just the same way they don't respect me. And that allowed him to create a bond that, you know, on a very kind of emotional level, I think, spoke to people in a way that any kind of series of policy proposals dreamed up by wonks really didn't.
Yeah, it certainly won him the White House. The elites don't care about you, they don't respect you, and I do. That was like just more effective than any policy message he made during the campaign. When you think about presidential leadership, is it helpful to have a president who has a maw inside him? Is there another president, you can think of another modern president who had the similar need for affirmation that you talked about, Jeremy? And is it a good thing to have as a president because it makes you do things that the public will support, or is it a dangerous thing for a president to have?
Well, I mean, I think the way that the opinion poll, or the horse race polls were an obsession for him over the course of the presidential campaign, the public opinion polls will become that. His approval rating as president will become that when he takes over the White House. I've honestly never seen, I mean, you know, public servants, people who run for president, have this insatiable need for attention, and there's often, as David has said in his recent interview with President Obama, there's something wrong with these people. It's like something happened to them in childhood, and they're running for office to get over that and to compensate. But with Trump, it's unlike anything I think any of us have ever chronicled. The need for attention, the need for affirmation. I mean, you're talking about somebody who, after he won the White House, decided to go on a nationwide tour congratulating himself.
And I would just add, and this is public, so we read about it on our blog at the time, I'm not violating any confidences, but when on election eve, he had not yet officially won, but at this point it was very clear that he was going to be the president, he was going to win. Our colleague Pat Healy called him to just sort of ask him for comment on how...
Because he picks up his... Pause here for a second. He is the only presidential candidate I have ever dealt with who will pick up his cell phone. And to this day, he still picks up the phone.
And even when he doesn't recognize the number.
Right. Yeah.
Because Senator Corker said that he called him on his cell phone, and that he didn't have an identifier on it. And so the president-elect, and hello, who's this? You know, it's like, this is not what usually happens with presidents-elect.
No.
Usually you have to go through 3 press secretaries and David Axelrod before you can get the president on the phone.
But so Pat Healy calls him just to get some comments on, what does it mean? And that week, a bit earlier that week, Jeremy, myself, and 2 other of our colleagues had written a story about Trump in his last week. That was not a particularly flattering story. It was not a portrait he liked. And so as he's talking to Pat Healy, as he is hours from becoming the president-elect, the thing he chose to talk about was a detail several paragraphs down in the story that was negative. And he said, that's not true. And it just sort of gives you a sense of where his head is. David would know, but I have to assume other people, they are assuming the presidency. They are not worried about petty slights and little grievances and a clause 7 paragraphs down in a story that ran a week ago.
They didn't take my Twitter away, I think is what it was. Wasn't
Yeah.
it? Because then Obama got under his skin. Well, Obama was very effective at this because, frankly, it doesn't take much. But getting inside Donald Trump's head and really piquing him, with the Twitter comment, the Twitter detail in our story that his aides during the final weeks of the campaign had convinced him to relinquish his Twitter account and let them control it. And I know this is true because I saw this myself. I saw him dictating a tweet to Hope Hicks, his press secretary, who then cleaned it up a little bit and sent it out. And he's on the phone on election night, as Ashley said, hours from becoming president, saying, they didn't take my Twitter away. What are you talking about? Tell them that they were totally wrong. So it's an attention to what is written about him and a need to be seen in a positive light that, as I said, I think is unlike anything we've seen.
But this has ramifications, though, that are not confined to the space of media. In the context of this conversation right now, we're seeing the appointments of all these various people to cabinet positions and to lower level positions. He's forming the team around him, or to a strong degree, Mike Pence is forming the team around him. And that's sending a message in a lot of different ways about the way that this administration is going to approach policy. Except what it doesn't account for is the fact that Donald Trump isn't necessarily going to be happy with what these people do once they are in these jobs. He loves nothing more than to fire someone who he thinks is falling down on a job or is doing a bad job. I would not be surprised if this presidency has far more turnover at the cabinet level than previous presidencies that we've been used to, primarily because if you are the secretary of a department that he does not particularly care about, and you go in front of the cameras on Capitol Hill and you come across looking like you're foolish or you don't know what you're talking about or you just fall flat on your face, it would not surprise me for Donald Trump to fire you before the end of the day, and it's something that he's become used to as an element of his personality. But
That's
I think
why we know him as a household name.
Yes,
Or if you come across as looking too good, that's the other counter
yes,
side.
well, that's true. Though I think though that there's a certain, we're going to find out who he actually respects out of these people that he's named. He clearly respects Mattis. And Susan has joked that that's only because of his nickname, Mad Dog. But I think that is, one of many reasons to respect Mattis. But it's one of these things where if he respects the person and they offer a critique, and I've been told this by many of my close friends who have briefed him and who have had criticisms of him, if he respects the person, he will listen to that critique and he will ask questions and he'll try to figure it out. But if he doesn't respect the person, if he doesn't have that level of built up trust in them, he'll cut them off at the knees. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is, again, it's very different, but it speaks to his need to constantly be fixing and tweaking and forcing tension and conflict because he believes that results in good things.
Another reason he may have more turnover at the cabinet level is because I think if you think about the ways in which this cabinet is different from other modern cabinets, one is that he doesn't have longstanding relationships with most of the people in his cabinet. Many of the people he met for the first time when he was desperately looking for someone to fill his cabinet with. It's a group that has less experience in government than other modern cabinets have had. And you also have seen in the confirmation hearings for the Secretary of State designate Rex Tillerson, for James Mattis for Defense Secretary, for the CIA hearing we saw today with Mike Pompeo, that there is what you have described as foreign policy schizophrenia going on when you look at the Trump cabinet. What do you mean by that?
Well, first off, let me just say my own bias is that I think that the American people actually have a fairly consistent foreign policy view, that they tend to be fairly Jacksonian, that they don't want to be messed with, and when they are messed with, they want to deal with the problem and solve it. And that we kind of swing in different directions. Sometimes we're more globally minded, we want to do more things on a humanitarian side. Sometimes that leads us to pull back and want to retreat and not be as involved in different places. I think what he is assembling here is a group of people who include some real hawks when it comes to the approach that they want to use in the Middle East, but also some people who want to be more restrained in other ways. They want to build up the military, but they don't necessarily want to use it. And that's something that I think is going to create a scenario where the first time that we have a real crisis in a foreign policy sense, it will be the first time that Donald Trump is going to have to make a decision that isn't just criticizing what other people have done. He got a lot of truck out of criticizing 16 years of bipartisan leadership that people have generally been dissatisfied with, or they don't like the outcomes, and that's fine. But the difference is between being someone calling in and saying, well, if I had John Fox's job, I would have done this. Okay, but then you get the job and you have to call the play, and you can't take the play call back. You can't just criticize it. And so I think he's going to now be in a position where we're going to figure out fairly quickly who he actually listens to out of that cadre of people with varying views as it relates to foreign policy. And it may not be the people we expect. It turned out under George W. Bush that he listened a lot more to Colin Powell and to Condoleezza Rice than we necessarily thought, compared to some of the other people who were more hawkish in his administration. And we have to kind of wait till the crisis to see what that looks like.
And of course, we assume there will be a foreign policy crisis.
There always is.
Well, there always is. And also, there'll be adversaries who are intentionally going to try to be provocative or test the new president. You've seen that happen before, Jeremy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ben and I were talking about this earlier, how one of the first tests of George W. Bush happened in his first 100 days when the Chinese forced down an American spy plane, and they had to immediately react. It's not unforeseeable at all. It's easy to envision something like that happening with China, especially now that Trump has antagonized them, and there is this raging debate over what they're doing in the South China Sea. So we'll see.
With China, it could be with North Korea, could be actually with Russia. And I find that the president-elect's attitude toward Russia, I think, has perplexed a lot of Americans. Tell us about that. Has this been consistent through the time you've covered him? And what do you think is behind his very favorable view, apparently, of Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's certainly, I was actually thinking yesterday at that press conference, obviously Russia dominated, and it made me think back to the last press conference he had held 6 months ago where the headline was Russia, because at that press conference he urged Russia to hack Hillary's emails and release everything they had. So I would say this has been an issue that has sort of popped up and clouded him a bit for a very long time. And I think, again, what he likes about Russia and Putin is that Putin has been pretty savvily quite flattering towards Donald Trump. And that is what Donald Trump likes. He likes people who flatter him, and he also respects strength. You often hear him talking about how he would be so strong, how, President Obama landed somewhere and he had to go down the back staircase, or they didn't send the appropriate people to greet him. And Trump describes, if that ever happened to me, I would turn the plane around and I would fly right out of Cuba or wherever the country is. And so I think sort of in Putin, he sees another strong man.
Here's the Pew Research Center, which does such terrific polling, put out a poll today on American attitudes toward foreign policy. And they ask Americans to identify what was a major threat to the United States interests. And on the question of Russia, 67% of Democrats said Russia presented a major threat to the United States. 41% of Republicans said it did, which is at odds with long-standing, don't tell Ronald Reagan,
well, just rewind
but only 41% of
to
Republicans, that's right. Is this been the issue on which the Republican Party is going to split?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that, but I would point out something that I think gets underestimated a little bit in the conversation about Putin. I think Putin has done a very good job at promoting himself as a defender of Christianity against radical Islam in the Middle East. And for a lot of American Christian communities, especially people who don't particularly pay a great deal of attention to foreign policy. I think that framing of what he's been doing has been relatively successful. And so I heard more than once from a lot of socially conservative Christians during the course of this cycle, well, why do we have to be antagonistic toward Putin? He's the one who's trying to fight, radical Islam in the Middle East, and that kind of thing. And that perspective, I think, is not is something that was, again, sort of played up in this. But when it comes to the sort of splits in the Republican coalition, I think the biggest question coming out of this cycle is really how much Donald Trump is going to live up to delivering on all of the promises that he's made. He has made an absurd degree of promises about what he's going to deliver and about this, what it means to sort of achieve some definition of American greatness. And I think that the problem for a lot of Americans is that they're going to run smack into the reality of what government in Washington can and cannot do. That it can't throw the lever back on the global economy, that it can't bring back jobs whose industries have gone away, and that it can't necessarily create things in an economy that's shifting more to service industry and things like that are going to be going to create the kind of jobs and the kind of lifestyles that for many Americans with just a high school education they were able to enjoy as recently as a couple of decades ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really going to be the challenge, because if you're the party in power and you're the one who's setting the agenda and you have the ability to set your agenda for at least 2 years, potentially 4, without
maybe 8,
maybe even 8, without the hedge of another party really able to stop you, then you have to deliver. People ask for change, they want Washington to change. That change has a lot of different definitions for a lot of people, but you have to deliver on it more than not, and I think that's going to be the real challenge.
Here's something that the Republicans started delivering on at 1:30 this morning when the Senate held a vote and began the move toward repealing the Affordable Care Act, and Trump at his news conference made it clear, and some other Republicans are also supporting this idea, although it's not clear how you do it, that you do the replace part immediately, that you have a Republican plan. You don't do repeal and delay, you do repeal and replace. Jeremy, talk through what you think is going to happen on the Affordable Care Act. What kind of, by the end of the year, are we going to have some different health care plan?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think to Ben's point, this is a test for conservatives. How do they govern? Now that they are no longer the opposition, now that they have the keys to the kingdom, and they have all of ththese policy ideas that I think they would argue are smart and help people lift themselves up. Kind of the old Jack Kemp philosophy of what I guess compassionate conservatism was before Bush invented that term. Okay, so is it going to actually work? Can you get enough Republicans in both houses of Congress to agree on a singular approach? And so far, the answer is absolutely not. Because right now, what they're talking about doing, at least some of them, is passing a repeal that is effective in 2018 or sometime further on down the road, so they can spend a year or so fighting it out over what exactly the replacement plan is. And that's not very encouraging.
But that's not what Trump says he wants to do.
Right, well, that's where I wonder if that's another one of these instances that we've seen where Trump doesn't really understand how the mechanisms of government work.
Well, but isn't that going to be fun when he finds out? Isn't that? I mean, there are two things I'm really looking forward to. Number one is the first time he has a fight with Mitch McConnell and just tweets out pictures of turtles all day. And the second is when Ted Cruz inevitably shuts the government down on it.
Yeah.
That will be a lovely fight. But my view of this healthcare thing is, the fact that Tom Price was the pick for HHS and the fact that Seema Verma from Indiana was the pick for CMS tells you that this is Mike Pence's job, in the sense that Pence, who is close with both of these people, is clearly trying to shape or trying to coalesce this around something. The question is how long that takes. I think you're probably right, though, that it looks something like a can kick for a certain amount of time while they figure out which one of these plans they want to coalesce around. The fact is they have about a dozen different plans, but there's a key difference that has to be fought out within the conservative community on this. I don't know if this is too much in the weeds, but the real difference is, do you keep the pre-Obamacare baseline of how much you are, in other words, do you keep the taxes that are within it to pay for the program and then use it in a different way? Or, and this is the fiscally conservative, conservative caucus within the House kind of position, no, when you repeal it, you have to repeal those too. You have to you have to get rid of all that money that you could have used in some other fashion to pay for healthcare in a way that you.
Well, Mike Pence is going to have a lot of jobs because he's going to have to read all those intelligence briefings that Donald Trump has said he doesn't want to read. But no, I mean, I do think one of the key takeaways here is that we fundamentally need to rethink our conception of what the presidency is, because Donald Trump is going to take a different approach to the job than anyone who has been president in our lifetimes. He's going to do an extreme amount of delegating to Mike Pence, to his cabinet secretaries. He's going to travel around the country holding these self-congratulatory events.
He
for
loves
himself.
cutting ribbons, man.
He's
cutting ribbons.
He's going to phone CEOs of companies directly and threaten them not to move their factories to Mexico or China or wherever. And he is going to leave the rest of the job to his underlings.
And in a way, that strategy actually makes a certain amount of sense, because I remember when we first heard that Donald Trump was going to become president and still basically continue to hold campaign rallies. And I was kind of asking his aides, well, what? And they're like, well, yeah, it's kind of great because he will, he's bored so easily. It's impossible to get him to engage, kind of on the policy minutia. It's like a headache for us. And so they were like, he'll delegate this, as you guys said, to Mike Pence or the appropriate people. And then the thing he can go out and do is sell stuff. So he will not necessarily, he'll certainly be involved in the plans. Nothing will get passed that he doesn't agree with, certainly, but he may not care about, the in the weeds clause that a rules committee fights over. And then he goes out and he gives these big rallies and he sells the plan. And I will say, having covered him, that there is the shortest amount of time I've ever seen between a phrase he says and between his supporters immediately repeating it back. Some stuff, those nicknames were very catchy. Some stuff was a lot less catchy, but you would still hear reporters or supporters chanting it back. So if he can sell those plans, I think his aides would really happily accept that.
Well, I would just say that sometimes reality is a bigger factor when you're governing than it is when you're campaigning, and reality may catch up with him. But if you want to know how powerful Mike Pence is, you may have missed this story, which, by the way, USA Today had exclusively this morning, which is the official government style book was changed today so that people who live in Indiana are no longer officially by the federal government referred to as Indianians, which had been the previous style, but as Hoosiers. And this may not be important to you, but apparently this is important to people from Indiana because that has now been changed. When you talk about Trump's relationship with Mitch McConnell or with Paul Ryan, what is it going to be? And is it going to be actually like Paul Ryan, no one cares more about the details of policy than Paul Ryan does. So does that mean that the congressional Republican leaders are going to have a lot of power to pass what they want and Trump will just call it Trump's plan? Or how is it going to work in terms of his relationship with leaders of Congress?
I think that's a good, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I think it's something we're going to have to see play out in some of these fights. And the other thing that will be interesting is to see how much does Congress kind of jump when Trump issues sort of a decree from on high or an order. And so the two things he's said about healthcare, for instance, they can both be done, but not simultaneously. So he said, I want Obamacare repealed immediately or in the first 2 weeks. That can certainly be done. He also said he wants it repealed and replaced near simultaneously. Right. That can also be done if you give them the chance to debate a replacement plan and pass it, but they can't be done at once. So it'll be interesting to see which of the decrees Congress sort of chooses and how that works. But I don't have a great sense of the relationship.
Go ahead.
I know. I was thinking, why would he say something like that is so obviously impossible to achieve, repeal and replace simultaneously? And I think it's not
and
just
immediately.
Yeah, and immediately, right? And it's not just that he's smart enough to understand that something like that is extraordinarily difficult to do and near impossible, but I think he's saying that because he is kind of he's an artist in terms of selling the impossible. And if he says it enough, then it becomes true. And I think there's part of him that actually thinks, well, yeah, if I'm involved, why can't I do this? Why can't I sell this and get it done?
There's definitely, to your question, there's an optimistic class of conservatives on Capitol Hill, and that would include, I would say, Paul Ryan among their number, who basically are of the mind similar to what we've heard from a lot of the West Coast Straussians and people like that during the course of Trump's rise, that Trump is this blunt object who is also can be a vehicle for all of these policies that they've been working on for years on Capitol Hill, and he's just very confident that that's going to be the case. I am not someone who necessarily agrees with that, mostly because I think that Donald Trump is not going to be very interested in cutting back on Medicare. But I think that one of the things that that you also see, though, is this form of I would say Trump curious is the way that a lot of these people are kind of thinking about it. They're cautious about the way that they view him, and they think, I can maybe work with him in some ways because he will do these audacious things or these aggressive things. And I think a perfect example of that is Rand Paul. Rand Paul wants to have, a repeal and replace, as quickly as possible in terms of his approach, and that's an extreme position within his own party, and yet it's one that is simpatico with Trump. Now, when Trump starts doing things on civil liberties, he and Rand Paul are not going to see eye to eye, and Paul knows that and is preparing. How am I going to fight that when it happens? Who are the people on the other side who I will need to ally with when there's a particular civil liberties issue where we're going to have to fight him? I think that that's going to be where more people end up. I think that there's just a lot of optimism among a lot of people in the Republican leadership right now because they just feel like, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to be able to do everything that we wanted to do, and he'll just rubber stamp it. I don't think that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I hear from some congressional Republicans, they think they can control him, like they can get the good side
good
of
luck.
him. But in terms of the energy and the ability to connect with Americans, and that because he won't be engaged in the details of things, that it gives them a lot of sway. And I don't know, is that how it will work?
I mean, I think that the media included, the American public has really extraordinarily underestimated Donald Trump and misunderstood him, misunderstood what drives him, what drives his supporters, and to hatch up some grand scheme to try to force Donald Trump to be your vehicle for your policy ideas when you're talking about a guy who doesn't really care all that much about policy, who was never as much about ideology as he was about an attitude. It doesn't seem like a great plan.
But I would also just briefly add that the Democrats also, and it may have changed a little with Schumer now, but we're also just as cautiously optimistic because they sort of felt same thing. Empty vessel, he's non-ideological. What he loves is the deal, right? He likes the deal. Schumer is sort of a deal maker, and there are a number of issues where Democrats are very clear that there are certain issues they can never work with Trump on, but on trade, on infrastructure, even a lot of what he has said, especially now with Ivanka, on women's issues. They can sort of get behind, and they were also cautiously optimistic that when there's a chance to make a deal, they're happy to work with him and do that.
So people are both terrified and cautiously optimistic.
Basically.
Fun to see which impulse turns out to be the more accurate one. We're going to go to questions in just a minute. First, I want to just talk just briefly about the Democrats, and one Democrat in particular, and that would be Barack Obama. I'm sure we all, did everyone, who watched Obama's speech? Was anyone at Obama's speech? Oh, nice. And how many people watched Trump's news conference? I'm just curious. So a very informed crowd here, clearly a lot of smart people. Do we have a sense of what role Barack Obama sees for himself in a Trump era? Is he the face of the Democratic Party? Is he the face of the opposition, which would be somewhat at odds with what modern presidents have done when they left office? What's Obama going to do?
It would be extraordinarily at odds with what modern presidents have done once they left office. I think Bernie Sanders is certainly making a play for that role to be the leader of the Democratic Party. I don't know. You look out there and you see not a deep bench. I mean, there are people like Kirsten Gillibrand who are certainly young, ambitious, and see themselves in that kind of role. But I think that is what the Democratic Party in the wilderness over the next 2-4 years is going to have to figure out.
But you think Obama goes off stage?
I can't imagine that if there's an issue that tugs at his core, something involving race or something, or something like that, that he wouldn't somehow eventually get involved. But
I'm expecting to hear a lot from him. I mean, he's staying in D.C. He's going to be around all of this. Trump is going to be unwinding a lot of things that he cares deeply about. I don't know, though, whether he can effectively be the face of the party, because I think the party is still coming to grips with the fact that it needs someone new. It needs new leadership. It's looking, I think, for that in a lot of different places. And it's really a question who's gonna emerge and really seize it. It's a real interesting moment.
So I've been reporting a story that sort of deals with this actually on a slightly more trivial note, but the best sense I've gotten from talking to people in the president's orbit is that he is not going to be leading the resistance from Kalorama, right? He is not going to be going up to NBC and doing cable hits. He's not going to be tweeting. He's not going to be weighing in on a budget resolution making its way through the House. But as Jeremy said, on things that are sort of core and fundamental to him on issues like healthcare, and not even necessarily his healthcare plan, but his belief that like Americans deserve, affordable health coverage, or climate change, or a belief in the Constitution and democracy. If he believes that is being undermined, I think he will weigh in, strategically, but not frequently.
I could see if there's a Muslim ban that President Obama would feel compelled to speak up. But I could also see if we have a national security crisis that Trump could turn to Obama for some advice. I think either scenario has at least some possibility of happening. Okay, final question, and then we'll go to your questions. My very first editor was Bob Greene at Newsday, legendary editor, a fantastic guy, weighed about 400 pounds. Huge, big personality. And I was just out of school, and he would say, follow the pea, not the shell. That is, figure out what's important, don't get distracted by the razzle-dazzle, which is a lesson I've tried to learn over the past year over and over and over again in covering Donald Trump. Follow the pea, not the shell. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just briefly say, identify a P for us, not maybe the most important P when it comes to covering President-elect Trump, but something that you think might turn out to be important, something that we should be keeping our eye on. Let's start with you, Ben.
It's something that I think we didn't really talk about tonight, which is the culture war. I think the culture war was a major factor in this election in a way that we didn't really come to appreciate. I think a particular example of that would be the level of support among American evangelicals for Donald Trump, which was driven in large part by a belief that they had lost the culture war and that Democrats and liberals were traveling the battlefield shooting the wounded. They felt very under attack. They felt that their views were under assault, and so they stopped caring about whether the presidential nominee that they had or the vehicle they had was someone who actually read the Bible, and they just cared that he said that he's going to make everyone say Merry Christmas. and in a post-apocalyptic environment, that kind of defensive strongman means a lot. The question is, what does Donald Trump do when he gets into a cultural fight? And he's going to get into them. There's going to be fights about Title IX. There's going to be fights about education. There's going to be fights about transgender bathrooms and locker rooms. There's going to be issues that he doesn't really want to deal with in this space because he's not particularly comfortable talking about them. I don't know how he's going to react to that. And I think that will be a very interesting moment the first time that he has to.
Yeah, interesting. Ashley, what's your P?
My P that I tried to follow during the campaign is Trump. I think more than other administrations, you pay attention to Trump. If a press release says something, if an aide says something, if anyone other than Donald Trump himself says something, it does not matter. Like, you follow Trump's actions and his words, and it's very easy to do because he communicates unvarnished on Twitter and in press conferences. And I just think he is the only person whose word you can count on him following.
So follow the P, not the shell. What's the P?
Well, Trump is a master of misdirection. I mean, he is so good at distracting us, the media, the public, from whatever crisis is currently engulfing him. I mean, it's a guy. You're talking about a guy who, when he was under assault for not releasing his taxes, he accused Ted Cruz's father of being involved in the Kennedy assassination, right? So he's very, very good at this. We all laugh and said, like, what a dope. Like, no, he's very savvy at this.
I am still concerned we have not solved the mess of Rafael Cruz wandering this planet.
Trump is going to appoint, he's going to empower Jeff Sessions to look into that. So I think that I've got my eye on Mike Pence. and what I think could really be a shadow White House inside the White House, because the vice president, given all of the delegation that Donald Trump is going to do, is going to have immense power, unlike anything we've seen in modern times. And I know every vice president likes to say, well, I've been the most powerful vice president in modern times. This time, I think it's really true.
Interesting. Well, this has been great. So we're going to have your very smart questions. And sir, you are first.
Hi, my name is Matt Enlow, and I'm a second-year student at the law school. Tonight, you spoke briefly about some of the promises Trump has made, or as Jeremy said, selling the impossible. However, it now seems that many of his promises were in fact lies, and as with his charity, he's defrauded the American people. I just found out that even today, the House voted to pass the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, or REINS Act, which is a great way to set the stage for my question. To what degree is the coalition on the right viable if people come to realize that Trump, and to some extent the GOP generally, wrote them checks that they couldn't cash?
I'm going to guess you were not a Trump voter.
No, not at all.
Who wants to field this question?
Well, this is actually a good example of the Trump as vehicle for things we want to achieve. The REINS Act is something that conservatives, limited government types, have really wanted to pass and sort of worked on for a long time. And that's one of these situations where you're trying to devolve power essentially out of government offices. But I think that your question about kind of selling a bill of goods to the American people, I think that so much of that has to do with the economy more than anything else, which, we can debate about this, but actually I think that the perceptions that people have about things getting better or worse within an economic measure are going to matter more for that than any of the other promises. If things are good with the economy, people won't be complaining about the other things he didn't do. But if the economy dips, then all of those things start to matter again and they all add up.
Well, I think it also has to do with the promise that he made to bring about change. I mean, he's more similar to Barack Obama in that way as a candidate than a lot of us like to admit. But he really did come to Washington vowing to shatter the system that have left so many of his supporters unempowered. So if Washington, the gears in Congress grind to a halt, and the next 4 years are a lot like the last 6, where nothing really gets done in Congress, and Washington looks paralyzed and dysfunctional, then I think that could also really be damaging to him.
Yeah, right. And as Barack Obama found, draining the swamp is harder than you think. Next
Thank you.
question. Thank you, sir.
Hey, Ronan Shatsky. I'm a first year in the college. So you can make the argument that it was the incessant press coverage of Donald Trump during the election that pretty much gave him the victory, in addition to feeding his insatiable urge to be on TV. So how can we, and how can you as journalists, adequately cover what we will be doing as president without giving him exactly what he wants again?
Well, let's talk a little about the coverage. That he did get incessant coverage, and particularly uncritical coverage at first from cable TV. Did the press not do a good job in covering this? Do you think in covering this campaign, not do the kind of job we need to do in our role in this democracy?
I mean, I think there are certainly moments you can point to of, for instance, cable news showing, instead of showing Jeb Bush or whoever else was actually speaking about a policy, showing an empty podium awaiting Trump's arrival is sort of a bit of soul searching that journalists need to do. But I will say, and the thing that was frustrating, although I don't necessarily put this all on the press, is in a way he sort of showed the impotency of the press, because the press actually did a lot of fact checks on what he was saying. The New York Times used the word lie in a story. He's lying, lie in a headline. Normally journalists would try to write around it a bit and say, others disagree with that assessment, or that's not quite how it is. But what was striking to me was how you would do a fact check, or there would be very strong articles on his conflicts of interest, or a temperament that might not be suited for the Oval Office, or any of these other things. And what was striking to me was not that the press sort of wasn't performing its role as watchdog, but that it just did not simply matter.
Mm-hmm. Because in the weeks leading up to his election, think about all of the news about Donald Trump. I'm not one who buys this notion that the media is to blame for Donald Trump's election. I think that's nonsense, because when you look at what happened over the last weeks of the campaign, there were stories about his charities being engaged in potentially fraudulent activities, stories about him bragging about sexually assaulting women, and stories about him not paying his taxes for 2 decades. These are not positive stories. We're not giving Donald Trump a pass. And yet he was still elected president. So as to Ashley's point, none of this ultimately, well, I don't want to say none of it mattered, because it certainly mattered, because he lost the popular vote by almost 3 million. But there were people who were so hungry for a different kind of leadership in Washington that they were willing to overlook this man's enormous
In a very
flaws.
brief point, this was an election where sort of, famously this talked about a lot, but you were often not voting affirmatively for someone, but voting against the other candidate. And so oftentimes whoever was in the news, Hillary or Trump, was the candidate who was losing that news cycle and getting the worst coverage. And Trump was in the news a ton. And I would just argue that people, by the end of the campaign, if you paid any attention, you knew exactly what you were getting with Donald Trump, and you voted for him.
I don't think that we should lay this at I think we should make some distinctions here. Straight news reporters who were focused on reporting facts, I think, actually did a pretty good job this election. I think that the real failure was in the analytical class of people who are not reporting facts. They're reporting more about narrative, and they're looking at the broader storyline and things like that. I think a lot of the analysts who got this election wrong need to do some soul searching about that. But when it comes to television, I think that there really was, I think that Donald Trump would not have won the Republican nomination if not for the way that he was treated early on, which was as a sideshow. When it became clear that it was for real, the problem was that the cycle was so compressed that time frame was basically, you went from Donald Trump not getting a lot of really serious hard questions in interviews to about 2 months later, everyone giving him hard questions in interviews and really taking him much more seriously as a candidate, much more forceful in the way that they covered him. And the problem was that the Republicans had compressed their cycle down to such a short amount of time
exactly right.
that he was able to ride that early momentum, uncritical coverage, just showing him on the podium all the time, effectively an ad for his campaign over and over and over again every day on cable news. And he was able to ride that through the wave of when media started to be, well, wait, this is real. Now we have to treat him like a candidate, and not like
not a
celebrity.
stand-up comedian.
Yeah, exactly.
It's become a cliche, and I want to give credit to whoever came up with this, because it wasn't me, but that the press covered Trump literally but not seriously, at least at the beginning, but voters treated him seriously but not literally, and that was a big difference. I think that Trump won and Clinton lost, and it wasn't and the press didn't do that. But I think the press's failure was not to understand what was happening with voters, not with the candidates, and that's with the depth of unhappiness that fueled the election, so that it became a surprise. But anyway, let's go to the next question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yang. Even though Ben just nicely mentioned that Trump's cabinet pick is kind of schizophrenic in terms of his foreign policy vision, but I still have a question about this issue. It's curious to see that lots of Chinese business elites and newspaper cheer at the fact that Trump win this election, because they believe that Trump is very transactional and he will be very ideologically friendly to China. But there's another theory saying that Trump might play a reverse Nixon, siding with Russia against China. So my question is, how does Trump's cabinet pick at this time confirm or disconfirm this theory? Is it worth it?
I like the phrase "a reverse Nixon," by the way, and I may use that in a story, but I will give you no credit.
I think that Trump is very transactional. I think when it comes to foreign policy, what will matter more to him is the appearance of what is going on rather than what is actually going on. And so I think, as it relates to our relationship with China, that's very much to be determined. But I think that one thing that we do see from something like the selection of Tillerson is this is someone who has made a career negotiating and testifying and being in the public eye and dealing with those sorts of things. I think that sends a message about the kind of person that Trump wanted in that job. It doesn't necessarily send a message about how he's going to relate to these various countries, but it does say this is what his skill set looks like. And that to me is less aggressive than some of the people he could have potentially picked. You know, this is not an administration that has gone in the John Bolton direction so much as it has in finding more people who are transactional.
So is it true that John Bolton didn't get the job because Trump didn't like his Mustang?
Probably partially.
I would hate that because my friends and I call his mustache Regis. We just gave it a name at some point because it seems like it deserves one, and I find that to be the most endearing thing about John Bolton.
I see. So he was wronged if that did cost him the job he wanted. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hi there. My name's Lucas. I'm a master's student in the social sciences program. Like a lot of fortunate people in Chicago, I had the opportunity to see the president speak on Tuesday night. And so I didn't hear the news about Trump's press conference until the day after. And I think like many people, the most bothersome part of that exchange was his interaction with the CNN reporter. His name escapes me, Mr. Acosta?
Jim Acosta. Right.
Acosta, right. And, his obvious inversion of definition of fake news, just to cascade the way he's been portrayed by CNN and all that. And, it just makes me wonder what will be the appropriate response of, news agencies in their interactions with the Trump administration that clearly, is very hostile to the way they've covered him in the past and how he believes, they've always been oriented towards his policies. And do you think do you think those kinds of hostile relationships with the press will change the way, presidential administrations are typically covered from this point on?
Susan, you're the bureau chief here. I mean, I would love to hear what I have my own thoughts, but you as a manager, how do you deal with a hostile White House like that? If the press secretary, or I guess in this case the president, from the podium threatens one of your reporters? So
it's actually usually hostile. I mean, even if it doesn't start out hostile, it usually becomes hostile. This is a little more publicly hostile than other presidents have been, but President Obama has had a very difficult relationship with the reporters who cover him every day as well, although it's not, as I said, in the kind of shouting match way that we saw yesterday. I think all you do as a journalist is put one foot in front of the other, do the best job you can, because I think the reporters in Washington feel like we're an important part of this democracy, and maybe more important in an era of Trump than we've been before. And I also think that we are, the fact is the best journalism we do is not access journalism, like being able to interview Trump or being able to interview. It's watchdog journalism, it's big data journalism, it's FOIA journalism. I mean, it's other kinds of journalism that gives you the things that are, I think, the most powerful. So since you mentioned that extraordinary exchange, I mean, who's ever seen an exchange where a president-elect is saying, "You're rude, sit down, you're rude, sit down."
You're fake news, right? Yeah.
To CNN, which had not published what was offensive about the Russia stuff, right? They published what was confirmed today on the record as an accurate story. So what did you guys think about that exchange? Was Jim Acosta doing the right thing?
He was, I mean, it's so hard in situations like that, right? With the cameras on and the lights on, and you're caught up in the moment, and almost anything you say in retrospect, you wish you would have done differently. If he had maybe
so
actually...
often in that situation.
It was a jerk store.
If maybe he had actually... jerk store. If maybe he had actually shouted his question out repeatedly instead of saying, "Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?" I mean, to your point about inverting the term fake news, I think that I actually wrote a whole story about this because I found it such a fascinating thing that people on the right, including the president-elect, have been doing in an attempt to kind of continue to tarnish the media as a whole. And I think regardless of whether or not CNN, as you correctly point out, Susan, published a part of the story that ended up being right, the fact that BuzzFeed put the whole salacious document online that is still unprovable tarnishes us all. We all get painted with the same brush. Yes. Conservatives understand this. They have always understood this, and they know that we will all suffer the consequences of it and therefore further be undermined as credible sources of information. And so what Trump did yesterday in calling him fake news can continue with diluting what that label actually means, which is a purposely false, misleading, fabricated story that is intended to harm a political opponent, sometimes for commercial reasons, and basically made it into a criticism of what he would consider to be the liberal mainstream media.
And one thing that Trump does wonderfully, even in his own team, but we've seen him do it with the media, is he sows dissension. And the BuzzFeed thing is a tough example because I don't think there were many news organizations who wanted to stand by what BuzzFeed did. But I do think one thing that the White House Correspondents Association will have to grapple with and reporters will have to grapple with is not allowing Trump to play favorites or have the media fight with each other. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is hold the president accountable and ask the president questions. And I have heard suggestions. David was saying, I've seen this on Twitter, I've heard this from other people. You know, if for some reason Donald Trump banned a certain reporter or a certain outlet from the briefing, or
Which he will,
or wouldn't let someone ask a question, you know, there's a thought, do you keep on asking the same question that he wouldn't take from one reporter just to make sure the question is answered? You know, what are ways you can show solidarity? And I don't, to the end of holding him accountable, not just for the end of press solidarity. And I think we don't know the answer, but that's something they'll be trying to figure out.
Well, you know, after Jim Acosta did this, he was trying to call in Mara Liasson from NPR, and she continued to she asked her question. And there was some thought that she should have said, well, I'll ask his question, or I think he should have a question, that you shouldn't. Now, I'm not criticizing her for not doing that because it's a really tough situation and we all have our own questions, and she asked a very good question and all that, but I wonder if we need to have more conscious, you know, as you say, a more conscious attitude.
Well, I think this is going to be something that's going to have to be worked out over the course of this. I mean, we saw it at sort of its crazy sort of definition the other day. But I do think that one thing that we need to recognize is that Trump is not going to change the way that he does this. He's going to keep doing it. He's going to do it to organizations that don't like, whose reporting he doesn't like. I mean, I've been on both sides of this because as a publication, we run a lot of pieces by people who were in favor of Trump, and then we ran a lot of pieces by people who were ardently opposed to Trump. We have on, you know, one of our senior contributors was in the top 10 recipients of anti-Semitic tweets, and she's just a nice mom from Brooklyn who writes for us, you know, for this cycle because of her opposition to Trump. But then we also have people who are completely on the other side. We have, you know, sexual assault victims who said, this is why I'm voting for Donald Trump. You know, a Midwestern minority, you know, students who had wrote about why they were voting for Trump and that kind of thing. And one of the things that I observed about that was just that Trump has enormous power to direct a lot of very negative attacks against individuals, and he does that more often than he does institutions. Like, he does institutions a lot, but it's the specificity of it's not just, you know, it's not just that he's going after CNN. He's literally yelling at Acosta and going over him and that kind of thing. And I think that one of the things we're going to have to work out going forward is just what his relationship is like with these individual journalists, which I think are going to be, is really gets into this messy area where he pays attention to what they're tweeting. He pays attention to what they're saying on TV. He's not just thinking of them as part of a journalistic institution that has a lot of people of varying opinions with varying approaches. And I mean, I don't know this personally, but my thought process basically on him is he makes no distinction, a distinction that virtually every other president would make, between somebody who's writing something on the op-ed page, the editorial page, and somebody who's writing it on the front page. A journalist who's just trying to do their job of reporting the facts, following the president, you know, telling the American people what he did today and where he was, versus someone who is weighing in on all of those things from a very opinionated standpoint. And I think he doesn't make that distinction, and that's going to have, I think, an impact on the way that his relationship works with them as well.
I've been told we have time for, thank you so much. We have time for just one more question. I'm so sorry because you people have been lining up there so patiently, but if we could just take one more question, and please go ahead.
Good evening. Given that the Republican...
And tell us who you are.
My name's Jessica. I'm a first year in the college. Given that the Republicans will have control of the government very soon, what area of policy specifically, whether it be immigration or healthcare or tax reform, do you think they should target first that would most strengthen and unify their party?
So what do you think?
You know, I think the Supreme Court appointment is going to do be very significant. When he said he's going to do it in the first 2 weeks. And he's said pretty clearly he's going to stick to that list that he put out before. Given the people who are involved in the selection process, I would assume that would be the thing. that would be a thing that matters. But keep in mind, not all Supreme Court selections go well.
Well,
But this could be
that'll
I mean, given that he's going to stick to that list, and that,
Yeah.
that list is very conservative, and almost no one on the right has any problem with anyone on it. It could be a unifying moment for the party in what could be a very brief honeymoon.
Unifying moment for the Republican Party,
Yes.
you mean? Yes, but
And maybe
of
for
course,
the Democrats.
Maybe it's a unifying moment for the Democratic Party too, because Chuck Schumer says they'll block anybody who's out of the mainstream, and that entire list, I think he would say, was
And then
out of the mainstream.
then you get into this whole fight over changing the filibuster, right? And I'm sure that's going to happen.
Right. You mean to get him through? Well, except not necessarily, because here's an asset that Donald Trump has that I think we're underestimating. 10 Democratic senators are up for re-election in 2 years in states that Donald Trump carried. So we should not assume it'll be so easy to hold the Democrats together in the Senate. Well, these questions have been fantastic. We've been honored to be here. And let me turn you back to David Axelrod.
I just want to say that there is a reason that the First Amendment came first. And there's nothing more essential to our democracy than a vibrant, functioning, independent press. And you've got in front of you a splendid example of 4 people who do their jobs very, very well. And so we not only thank you for being here, but we root for you every day to do the work that you do.